as Sandrine said, we're going to be talking about working with uncooperative families and really looking at some of the reasons, the implications, and the strategies. So, when the webinar was advertised, 12 suggested reasons were included in the advert, as it were, for the webinar as to why families are uncooperative. So, you'll just see that there's a poll on screen now, and maybe people can just vote for who the reason why they think families, in their experience, are more reluctant to engage with services. I'll just give you a few seconds to do that. So I can see at the moment that the sort of most common idea is that people don't see a problem, or that they fear being judged to be poor parents because of substance misuse or mental health problems. Evgeny, could you just move the poll out the way now, because it's interrupting my line of sight? Okay. So, as I say, these were 12 suggested reasons, and these were actually reasons which were pulled together by some of the local safeguarding boards, which is a specific mechanism which is under in the UK around trying to both identify and support issues around child protection within local areas. And so this is a sort of composite, and I think it's interesting to see that there's a whole range of different ideas. I've I think that we can perhaps think about families uncooperativeness around in four ways, really, or four different types of family patterns of being uncooperative. The first is what I've called non-engagement. So these are families which they either miss appointments, they refuse to meet, or when you speak to them, they change the conversation in a way they seem to be really difficult to get hold of. The second sort of category that we can think about, and personally, I think that this is one of the most difficult groups to work with, is a group that is sometimes called disguised compliance. So these are families which appear to agree, but then don't really follow up on anything or take any action, or they kind of make excuses for why things haven't been done. And these are families often that we see with this that they come to meetings, they participate, they will sit there and or they will say that they acknowledge a problem, but despite lots of help and lots of support, nothing ever really changes. And it's very difficult to sort of almost get hold of them. The first group of non-engagement is very clear that they're not engaging with you. The second group is much more difficult because it almost takes a while to realize that really they're not engaging with you either. The the third group of sort of uncooperativeness really is what I've called confrontational. So this is where people are or families are constantly arguing about what is being said. They might be complaining about services, um, which may be a legitimate complaint, or they may be questioning workers' abilities. So this is almost like a sort of diversionary tactic that they are engaging, but everything is pushing back onto the workers. There's always a reason. It's never anything to do with them. And the fourth kind of sort of type of cooperativeness, if you like, is where there's hostility and violence. And this may be actual violence or threats of violence and intimidation. I have to say, in my experience, this is the sort of the smaller group, and it's much rarer to encounter. But obviously, it can really impact upon everybody when people are frightened to engage with families. And I have to say that although I put these sort of uncooperativeness in four sort of categories, really, you can get a lot of crossover between them, particularly, for example, hostile and violent families will often be very confrontational, or maybe may not engage at the beginning. And when you begin to get them to engage, they may become very confrontational. And for all of these reasons, these families are very difficult to work with. Um, they are There's a lot of challenges for the worker, and obviously also for other members of the professional team, and for the children and the family themselves. But I think a challenge really that I would want to say is that, is there, with all of these ways of conceptualizing uncooperativeness or resistance to work with someone are very negative. But I wonder if there may be a situation or circumstances under which we could think about that uncooperativeness as more of a positive attribute towards about a family. Perhaps not so much hostility and violence, but I'm thinking sometimes in terms of a survival strategy for a family. While it might be misplaced, it may actually be very useful for them in terms of as a function. And I think if we can sometimes try to hold on to what might be the family's good reason for behaving in a way, I don't necessarily mean that means that we would consider it a good reason, but why that makes sense to them. It can be useful for us in terms of trying to engage with the family in a more proactive way. So, uncooperativeness impacts upon the child, the family, and the workers. And by that, I mean not only social workers, but also the wider professional network. And I'll go through some of the sort of implications and impacts on the each of those categories now. So um, ultimately, though, it's important to remember that the inability to engage with family due to their uncooperativeness, which may not be uncooperativeness, it may be something that we're doing as workers, but the ability to work with families can lead to children being left in abusive situations or placed at increased risk. It can also mean that families are denied appropriate support or face more punitive actions. And I think this is a very important thing to also acknowledge, that when we find families difficult to work with, two things tend to happen. Either we tend to disengage with the family, so the family are not given support because we get fed up with them, basically, or we become much more punitive and much more demanding of them than we would of a family in another situation. So we almost set higher expectations for them, and punish them for their inability to engage with us. It can also lead to workers feeling really undermined and subject to violence in extreme cases. And I know from my experience that actually workers, even very, very competent workers, can end up feeling incredibly impotent and useless as a result of engaging or trying to engage with a family that's not cooperative. And it can also lead to splitting of the multi-agency team, and that can have huge ramifications in the future for how professionals work together. So let's look at some of the sort of individual um, impacts and implications. So for the child, in a situation where the family is uncooperative, one of the things that happens for the child is this need to be able to cope with their situation, and they can do this by accommodating the behavior, by appeasing, so trying to keep people happy within the family, by and by identifying with their families, so siding with their families a lot, often as a way of trying to keep safer. So this is this almost is a very useful, if misplaced, behaviour by the child, because it's an attempt to keep themselves safe. So they're not going to say things um, which are going to upset people, which are going to um, cause their family additional problems. They will perhaps side with their family. So in an environment where everybody is being uncooperative, the child is also sort of brought into that system. As a result, or partly because of that, or as a result of, or as a contributor to that, children can also become very desensitized to violence and abuse. And I think this is very interesting when you are working with families where there's a high level of aggression and violence, how quickly children start to see this as being very normal. And of course, this has implications for the child both at that time, but also in later life. Um, Linked to the kind of coping with their situation, children learning to appease and minimize the situation with workers. So particularly telling people that everything is okay, always appearing happy and smiling. Again, they're almost sort of mediating or trying to we could understand this in a way as trying to keep things smooth and to keep things moving um, in a in a harmonious way in a situation where a family is not cooperating. And perhaps most worryingly, children being just too frightened to say what's really happening for them. So, because the family is very uncooperative in whatever way, children are reluctant to speak out about what is the issue for them. For the family, when there's a sort of uncooperativeness, whether it's whatever the reason for it, there can become increased tensions, and sometimes that includes violence within the family, and that includes scapegoating. And I mean by scapegoating, blaming of individual families. And I think this is particularly the case individual family members. And we particularly see this, for example, where maybe you have a mother and a father and children, and the mother will think that there's an issue, but the father doesn't agree. And the father is very resentful of outside involvement for whatever reason, maybe because he's frightened about being judged, maybe because he doesn't see there's a problem. But almost the intervention of the workers can lead to increased tensions and within the family and blame within the family. It can also lead to families being denied services and being denied support because people are fed up with them, or because people are don't believe that they will change, don't believe that it's worth trying to engage with them anymore, and so withdraw from families. And the other side of that is that families can then also be subject to punitive sanctions. So a lot more barriers that they have to cross. People have set much more higher expectations of them in terms of their cooperation. So there's a sort of duality there. Either people um, disengage, and so families don't get support, or people become too not too overly concerned and overly critical. Um, it also, I think, for the family can lead to the family being unclear or confused about expectations of them, and this is particularly where they may be getting mixed messages from members of the professional network. So they may get on very well with one professional, perhaps someone from health or education, who tells them that they're doing very well, and then they will be engaged with perhaps a social worker who's being very critical of them, and it's very unclear for them in terms of how they should be behaving and how they should be engaging with services and what we want them to do. And ultimately as well, I mean, if they are driven to violence, or they are becoming increasingly hostile and threatening, and the police become involved, or there's some other kind of legal procedures, this also has implications for them as well. I'm not saying here that it's the worker's fault if the family get involved with the police because they're being violent, but that does then have implications for a family if there is if violence and threats are also a pattern of their engagement. For the workers, there's I've got a much longer list in a way, because I thought it would be useful to think about the impact on workers. And you'll have to, I'll have to give just a slight apology here because I wanted to get it on one slide. And so the typeface will get slightly smaller as we go through the slides, but you should be able to still see it. So the implications and the impact on the workers really are feeling impotent and useless. And this, I think, is one of the things that people will most commonly say to me, and is my most common experience and most common experience of colleagues and friends of mine, is this idea that you just cannot do anything, and that you're really not don't have much value as a worker, that you're wasting your time, and this idea that maybe you just don't have the skills or the knowledge, and workers can start to blame themselves. And actually, if you're working with a lot of families who are very uncooperative, it can become extremely draining for workers to feel that there's any point in actually being there, and workers can really start to get burnt out and to feel that there is not really anything that they're able to do which is positive. So it sounds quite benign in a way, just feeling useless, but actually the long-term impact of this is can be quite severe on people. The other thing that happens for workers is a desire to avoid confrontation. So either ignoring or minimizing issues because they don't want to get involved in a confrontation with the family, or not seeing the child alone because they don't actually want to hear what the child is going to say because they believe the child is going to say something, and then they're going to have to address it with the family, and then there's going to be a confrontation, or avoiding the family altogether by not visiting, by not sort of taking opportunities to see the family, doing whatever they can to stay away or to minimize the confrontation. Similar to this is kind of completely disengaging with the family. So it's slightly different from avoiding confrontation, but this is really pulling away from the family. So being relieved when the family is not available, perhaps not proactively following up. So not telephoning, not making follow-up appointments, trying to withdrawing really. And we might think about that as sort of going through the motions. So I have to visit the family once a month. I go, I'm there for a shorter time as possible. I'm very superficial in my discussions with the family, and all of these have good reasons. I'm sorry about that. I suddenly got a message to say that the webinar was ending, and it just took a couple of seconds for it to reload. I hope everybody can hear me now. Um, so I think we've got as far to talking about mirroring, which is the next item. Let me just load that. And I was saying that this can set up a very unhelpful dynamic. Um, and as I say, look at this list now, I'm thinking to myself, it's very easy for workers also to start to blame themselves. And if you recognize any of these behaviors in yourself or in your colleagues, it's also very easy to start to believe that it's your fault and reinforce this idea that you're not a very good worker. But I think that these are very natural processes. And when we look at some of the strategies for dealing with working with uncooperative families, one of the things that I will highlight to you is the importance of supervision and working with others to try and work through some of these issues and to try to test out whether you or whether workers are falling into some of these unhelpful patterns of behavior. Another one is being over optimistic or being overly negative. So, whatever you see in a family, depending upon how the family normally behaves, you either become very critical about it or we can become very optimistic about it. And I remember myself working with a family who were notoriously difficult to engage with, and they kind of swapped between disguised compliance, so never sort of turning up for meetings but not doing things, and sort of non-engagement when they just would go missing, and we would find it very difficult to even get them to agree to see us. And I remember once managing to speak to the father on the phone, who said to me, "Oh yes, why don't you come round later on this afternoon and see us?" And I had this almost irrational sense of happiness, and was really feeling like we'd suddenly made a breakthrough with this family. And a colleague of mine said they've agreed to see you for one meeting. But I was so optimistic in terms of what I thought this meant, um, overly optimistic. The other thing, and this another sort of dynamic that can happen, is when we are very worried about ourselves and our own personal safety. um, Workers can feel be very hyper alert, and actually the fear that something is going to happen can really get in the way of listening to the family, making professional judgments, and actually engaging with the process. So again, this is a very understandable um, a very understandable thing to do. I've just been asked to speak less British. I'm not quite sure what that means, but I will slow down, Jera. Um, but we but what I'm saying here is that when we are frightened as workers, or when workers are frightened, it's very difficult to do anything other than be afraid. So it's difficult to engage with the family, to be proactive, to challenge a family, to talk, make a professional judgment if you are um, if you are frightened about your personal well-being. Um, For workers, again, in extreme cases, there could be violence either against themselves or against their possessions. So, if workers have a car, or some sort of transport, it could be towards the office or something like that. So, it's another extreme case, but we could experience violence. Sorry, my microphone is going to pick up a helicopter that's going overhead for some reason. Um, Another implication or impact is the splitting of the multi-agency group, and this can really lead to divisions between professionals. And what you sometimes see is almost a battle in the multidisciplinary team meetings, or whenever you have multi-agency meetings, with some professionals really being on the family side and being very sympathetic to them, and other professionals being very critical and very negative about the family. And for both of these, I mean, I think the discussion is a natural process. We all have different views, and that's part of the reason of having a multidisciplinary team meeting, so that you get, or a multidisciplinary team, so that you get these different views. But actually, in extreme cases, what you see is almost like a complete fracturing, a complete cutting, a split between the members of the multidisciplinary team, which almost makes it impossible to work together as to support the family, and has implications for supporting other families in the future as well. Um, and this can also lead to a lot of professional blaming, and the creation of a very negative atmosphere, which is very unhelpful in terms of trying to work in a collaborative way with other professionals. And we know generally that working together is a better way, gives better outcomes for children and families than when we try to work by ourselves, either as individual workers or individual departments. Okay, so some key considerations I think for us to make when we are, or to think about when we are working with a family that we think is uncooperative or we are judging as being uncooperative. The first thing I think to think about is, what are the implications for the child? So if we're disengaging, or if we've got a very unhelpful dynamic, or if the family is being uncooperative and won't actually work with us, what are the implications for the child? And we must always think about the safety and the well-being of the child as our primary consideration. So what messages are children getting from the way in which the workers react and the uncooperativeness of the family? And I think about this when you go to a family and the family is very hostile, or the family is very aggressive, and and children are there watching that, and you walk out of the house and you shut the door, what sort of message is the child getting about the behaviour of their parents and how other adults think about their protection? Another thing I think which is very important to think about with key considerations is to think about what is the impact of the behaviour and the attitude of workers, and how is this influencing uncooperativeness? What I mean by this is that what we sometimes define as being cooperative may have a very legitimate reason. If we go back to the 12 reasons, some of those reasons were around fear, around not understanding the problem. So what is it that workers are doing which is contributing to that? So is there something that I could do as a worker that would reduce the fear? Is there something I could do as the worker which would actually help the family understand better what is happening for them and why I need to be involved? And here I also think it's useful to think about what has been the what has been the involvement between the worker and the family previously. So in some cases, it may be useful, for example, the worker may have had a very good relationship with the family, but then something has happened and the worker has had to take some action that the family doesn't agree with or is unhappy about, and they've lost trust with the worker. It doesn't necessarily mean that the worker was wrong, but it may mean that the worker is no longer trusted. So thinking about how the worker themselves is playing into or contributes towards the uncooperativeness. What is the role of the multi-agency team in supporting the uncooperativeness? So are there members, is everybody from the multi-agency team also in agreement in terms about how best to engage with the family, and has a shared view on what their different patterns of behaviour and means? So have you got, for example, the teacher may be saying to the family, oh, well, you know what social services are like, they're always very critical, don't worry, and really undermining what the social worker is trying to do? Or have you got the social worker sort of undermining perhaps mental health or drug and alcohol services? So think about how the multi-agency team may be supporting some of that uncooperativeness. The other thing is that a key consideration, I think, is specialist help or advice needed to work more positively with the family? So that could be drug and alcohol advice, or learning disability advice, or mental health services, or some other kind of specialist service. And I accept that sometimes that's very difficult to get, but it is also useful to think about, well, should it be needed? I remember working with a family where both parents had a learning disability, and And I don't work with people with learning disabilities. And so it was a real challenge for me to think about how could I communicate with them and how could I present information to them in a way that they could actually take on board and they could actually understand and work with. And so I actually had to get somebody to help me understand how to present information to people where there are cognitive issues, because for me it's not something that I would do. I didn't understand about the different ways of communicating, and so I was going and doing the normal thing that I would do, which would be to go and meet and to talk and think that they had understood what I said. And then the day later or 2 days later, it would be obvious that they hadn't understood anything that I'd said previously or they had ignored it. And I think this is also very important as well if you're working where there are drug and alcohol problems, in terms of understanding how drug and alcohol may affect families and may affect their ability to engage with you and their ability to sort of be cooperative. And the other thing I think is to think about, um, do arrangements need to be made to keep workers safe? And this is a very practical issue. I don't like to suggest that families are not are always going to be dangerous. I don't believe that at all. But where workers are very worried about safety, where we are working with very violent and hostile families, thinking about knowing that there is a plan in place to keep workers safe can help the worker feel safe, but also help other colleagues feel safe as well. So, you know, is should we be doing joint visits? Is there a need to hold meetings in a neutral venue? Should you have the police involved to accompany you to a visit? These things needs to needs to be kind of considered in terms of how you can move forward with the family, because if you don't feel safe, as I mentioned before, it's very difficult to engage with the family in a proactive and positive way. So I'm going to come down to some strategies then, and then I think we'll be coming up to 10 o'clock. I realise we're a bit late starting, but that will give us some time for questions and thoughts. So some strategies, some are very obvious and I've mentioned them already. Some things may be less obvious but may still be useful to think about here. So the first thing I think is to try and understand the underlying reason or reasons for the uncooperativeness, because that may find a help may help finding a solution or a possible solution. So I think that I mean, although we sort of distinguished into the four different sort of categories of uncooperativeness, understanding what the reason behind that is can be very helpful. So if the problem is that I don't understand, um, the family is frightened because they don't really understand what my role is, unless we understand that and deal with that, that fear will always remain. So trying where possible to understand the underlying reason. The, the second thing I think is thinking about what I've called entry points and mediators. So are there other members of the family or the community who may be more positive about engaging and who could actually sort of help um, the family become more proactive and more less resistant to working with us? Or are there other sort of entry points? So workers who the family does have a relationship with, so maybe a health visitor, a health worker rather, or a teacher, or somebody in a daily centre, somebody that perhaps the family already trusts and already has a relationship with, and who may find it acceptable to have an approach from them. And I think that it's very useful up front for all families to provide really clear information about our role and our responsibility, and to provide this in an appropriate way. So maybe by a leaflet or something like that. If I mean, there are issues around literacy, but so that people are really clear about why we're there and what we want to do and what our purpose is. And I particularly like leaving a leaflet or something with a family who is able, doesn't have literacy problems, because I think that after you've left, they can go back and look at it again. I don't know if anyone here has ever been to the doctor. I'm sure most people have. But as soon as the doctor tells you that you're ill, you then stop hearing anything else that the doctor says while you're in the room. And after you've left, you come back with a whole series of questions. So I think sometimes when you turn up at somebody's house or when somebody meets a worker for the first time, it can be quite shocking or quite frightening. And so even though information is given at that time, it may not all be taken on board. The family may not understand everything, and so that it sometimes it's helpful to leave some information so that families have something to refer to. And I think it's also very useful to talk to families about how they can complain if they're not happy. Um, I know that sometimes surprises people when you say to them, this is how you can complain if you don't think you've got you're getting a good service from me. But people do have legitimate complaints, or sometimes people, what what starts as a very small concern by a family can escalate into a huge complaint and become a real source of uncooperativeness, and that's something that could have been dealt with very easily at the beginning. Another strategy is to use written agreements, or for families where there's low literacy levels, you could use another format such as recorded agreements, or you could, use some kind of diagrams or pictures or something. So families are really clear about expectations. This is slightly different from an action plan that we might have as part of a care plan for a child. This is more around the way in which we're going to work together. So I will come to visit you every Wednesday. We agree that I will come to visit you every Wednesday, and you agree that you will actually be there for the visit, or I will speak to the teacher about this situation, and you agree that you will take the child to school and also meet with the teacher, or agreements about if you're not able to make an appointment, you will telephone me. So something, so it's less, it's not so much a care plan, it's much more around how people work together, but making clear about what expectations are. And that can also be linking to what's the purpose. So why am I here? Why do I want to meet with you? Um, there will probably still be an action plan which is developed, or a care plan or something, with a multi-agency team, particularly if you've got a family where there is a very severe protection concern. And one of the strategies for helping manage uncooperativeness is to actually review that action plan much more frequently than perhaps you might normally do. So whereas perhaps you may review an action plan every 2 months or every 3 months, review it every month, so that people can really be clear about what is happening, how are things progressing, and that can help to avoid drift. So when what I mean by drift is when things just continue but nothing really changes. So, or splitting. So when the members of the multi-agency team start disagreeing and start maybe siding with the family and becoming arguing with each other, but also can help to share information in terms of what is happening with the family, how are they engaging, and so just think of what other strategies can be put in place, so that what else could be done to try and get the family to be more cooperative. You don't want to wait 3 months to decide that a family's been uncooperative for 3 months. You want to really be identifying that as a problem earlier on and trying some of these alternative strategies like thinking about other members of other workers that could go in, or what sorts of information that they might need. Um, Also, I think a strategy is to consider the venue and the location for meetings. So if family are very resentful about people coming into their home, or they're worried or they're anxious, always doing home visits is probably not going to be the most useful thing to be doing, because you're setting up a dynamic there where maybe you're going to increase their level of fear of being judged, or being criticized. But that shouldn't be at the risk of not engaging with the family. So you can consider the venue and the location for the meeting, but that doesn't mean that you should avoid having meetings. So think about this. This can also, I think, be very useful in situations perhaps where there are difficult tensions and dynamics between family members. Visiting in the home can actually make that a very unsafe place for people to talk. Visiting somewhere else can perhaps be more useful at times. Irrespective of that, however, it's absolutely important that the child is seen regularly and in private. So, and this could be at school, it could be in other um, in another setting, but whether you're able to visit the home or whether you're not able to visit the home, it's really important that the child is seen regularly. What I've sometimes seen, and have seen it work very well, for example, is that because of tensions and dynamics, it's been extremely difficult for perhaps a social worker to see the child. And so the agreement has been that the teacher will have a private meeting with the child to check in with them. I have to say, personally, I'm a bit um, unsure about that. I think it may work pragmatically, but if the level of tension and aggression is so high that nobody will let anybody meet the social worker, I really start to wonder, should we be doing something else then? And how safe is that family for everybody? Um, and I put that, coming back to my point previously about what messages do we give people. So if we say to people, you don't have to see me because you don't like me and you're very aggressive, what message does that give if I then say, but you can see this other person instead? I think it's slightly different if we know that someone is very frightened because I'm a male worker, or because I'm foreign, or because they've had a bad experience with me, and they would feel more comfortable talking to someone else. For me, that feels slightly differently than if we just excuse people because they're violent and aggressive. And that links into thinking about the most appropriate worker to see the family. Is it another member of the multi-agency team, or actually, is it right to actually decide it needs to be a new social worker because the relationship is so bad, or that the family's experience with the worker in the past has been so um, traumatic or difficult, maybe something that bad has happened to the family, which is not the worker's fault, but the worker has been involved with. Maybe there is a case for saying it would be useful to change workers here. I know that's not always an option in all cases, because in many cases um, in the region there is only one worker. But again, it's a strategy. If it's a possibility, it's worth thinking about. Sorry, this is the slide where it gets progressively smaller, just because I wanted to keep everything on one slide so you could see it. Okay, I mentioned it before, but I think it's absolutely critical to use supervision or kind of peer support, and or to help workers process feelings and opinions and reactions, to keep workers sort of balanced, and to keep um, strategies and interventions appropriate. The most important strategy, I think, for dealing with a family that anyone considers to be uncooperative is for people to be really open about how they think about it and how they understand what's going on. The worst situation is when people start to almost collude with the family and try to deny that they're being uncooperative, or try to hide that because they feel that the fact that they can't engage with the family in some way is a reflection upon them as a worker. If we think about what this lack of engagement can lead to, we're talking about children being left in situations of danger or being placed at increased risk. So while everyone may feel slightly embarrassed about admitting that they can't do something or they don't know what to do, for me, I think that's actually a better position to be in than to have a child that's in a situation of danger, or for a worker to go into a situation where they're frightened but they refuse to acknowledge that to people, and then they could be subject to danger themselves. I think also it's very important to be open and transparent about uncooperativeness and its implications with families, and to challenge families about their behaviour, but in a very neutral way. What I mean by this is we want to keep blame out of, we want to not get into an unhelpful dynamic where we're being critical and where we're blaming families. But at the same time, I think it's very important to challenge families about their behaviour and what that means and the implications. So one example I can give you is having a family where they wouldn't engage, and actually asking the family quite sort of openly, what did they think was the effect on everybody, on all of the professionals, when every time we went to see them they were never in. What did they think? How did they think we understood that? What sort of judgment did they think we were making? So not saying why weren't you there and getting into sort of arguments with them, but actually being quite neutral about it and saying, what do you think this means when this is what happens? And I think one of the most successful strategies that I've ever used or had seen used is to actually, when families are very resistant and they don't want you there, is to acknowledge that to parents and to say, I understand you don't want me involved. I understand you think this is useless, and I understand that you resent this. However, I have a legal responsibility to be here, and I'm not going to go away, and I'm going to keep coming all the time. And if I don't come, it'll be a colleague. So given that is the case, what do you need to do so that I can leave and not have to come back again? What change do I need to see? So rather than getting into a debate about whether they should be doing something or shouldn't be doing something, or the behaviour, to really shift it onto, well, let's work together so that I don't need to visit you again, rather than blaming them about what they're doing and what they're not doing. And the final thing that I've put, and then I think I've spoken about it for long enough, or the final two things, one was developing safety plans for workers if necessary, which I think is very important to make sure that workers do feel safe as a strategy. And linked to that, to document all incidences and ensure records are kept up to date. I mean, that is a strategy for working with uncooperative families, because what it does is it helps you see what the patterns of the family's behaviour are. And also, if you're worried about something like developing about safety, actually having a record of incidents is extremely important in terms of planning for the future. And even things like, visiting the family and the family wasn't home. This is very important to document, because in terms of when you're reviewing the action plan, when people are talking supervision, it can really, you're actually then talking about specific concrete things rather than, a vague sense that I don't think they're very committed. This is much more specific. And there's one small thing that I just put at the bottom there. You should still be able to read it, which links across all of them really, which is about sort of testing families' commitment. So um, I don't necessarily think that this is we should be making life difficult for families, but I think we should. It is sometimes appropriate in when we're thinking about, well, are the family really working with us, or are they just saying so because it's easy? Is it disguised compliance? They're saying that they're going to do something just because we're here, but as soon as we leave, nothing is going to change. So actually, giving them tasks to do, even if it's only coming to the office for a meeting instead of you going to visit them at home, can also be useful ways about seeing, well, how are people actually really engaged with us, or are they really just doing what they need to do until we leave them alone. I think I'll probably stop there because I've been talking for a long time and I understand it's very difficult for some people, partly because of my accent and the technology. And I do try to use simple English, but unfortunately some of these things are technical, and in a webinar it's quite